You know, there's a figure who dominates current discussions about space exploration and humanity's future beyond Earth more than anyone else. Someone whose vision and claims about Mars colonization have captured public imagination and influenced billions of dollars in investment and policy decisions. Elon Musk, the founder and CEO of SpaceX, has made Mars colonization his explicit mission. He talks constantly about making life multi-planetary, about establishing a self-sustaining city on Mars with 1 million people, about humanity becoming a spacefaring civilization with Mars as our second home. And he's not just talking, he's building what he claims are the tools to make this happen, the Starship rocket system that's supposed to carry hundreds of people to Mars at a time, with ticket prices eventually coming down to the cost of a house, with regular flights departing Earth every 26 months during launch windows, with the first crewed missions potentially in the 2030 seconds, and the 1 million-person city by the 2050 seconds or 2060 seconds. It's an audacious vision, an inspiring vision, one that's gotten enormous media attention and public support and has positioned Musk as a visionary leader taking humanity to the stars. And I'm going to tell you something that will disappoint anyone who believes in this vision. Elon Musk's Mars plan will fail. Not might fail, not faces challenges that need to be overcome, but will fail in the sense that the specific goals and timelines Musk has articulated are impossible to achieve. They're based on fundamental misunderstandings or misrepresentations of the physics, biology, economics, and logistics of Mars colonization. They ignore or downplay barriers that are insurmountable with any foreseeable technology, and they make promises to investors and the public that cannot be kept. The 1 million-person Mars city will not happen, not in this century, not ever. Ticket prices will not come down to affordable levels because the fundamental cost of Mars missions are enormous, regardless of how many times you reuse your rockets. Self-sustaining colonies will not be established because Mars cannot support them. The planet is fundamentally hostile to life in ways that make independence from Earth impossible. And Elon Musk either knows this and is deliberately overselling to maintain funding and support, or he's genuinely deluded about what's possible. But either way, the plan, as articulated, will fail. And it's important to understand why, so we don't waste resources chasing an impossible dream. Now, I need to be clear about what I'm claiming and what I'm not claiming, because this is a nuanced argument that requires precision. I'm not saying that SpaceX won't accomplish anything valuable. They've already achieved remarkable things, dramatically reducing launch costs with reusable rockets, revitalizing American human spaceflight capabilities, developing new technologies and approaches that advance the field. And they might well land humans on Mars eventually. That's technically feasible, though enormously difficult and expensive. Sending small exploration crews to Mars for scientific missions is within the realm of possibility if enough resources are committed. What I'm arguing is impossible is the specific vision Musk articulates. Large-scale colonization, self-sustaining cities, hundreds of thousands or millions of people living permanently on Mars, affordable tickets that make Mars accessible to ordinary people, economic viability where Mars settlements eventually become independent of Earth's support. These goals are fundamentally unrealistic. They ignore physics and biology and economics in ways that no amount of engineering, cleverness, or cost reduction can overcome. And pursuing them as stated will inevitably lead to failure, or at best to scaling back to much more modest goals like small research outposts similar to Antarctic stations. So when I say Musk's Mars plan will fail, I mean the grand vision will fail. The promises about million-person cities and affordable tickets and self-sustaining colonies, those are fantasies disconnected from reality, and they will not be achieved. But this doesn't mean all Mars activity will fail. It means the specific audacious goals that Musk uses to generate excitement and investment are not achievable. Let me start with the most fundamental problems. The ones I've discussed in previous videos about Mars colonization, but that bear repeating in the context of Musk's specific claims, because Musk either ignores these problems in his presentations or hand waves them away with vague assertions about future technology solving everything. The first fundamental problem is Mars gravity, which is 38% of Earth's, and this is not a minor inconvenience that can be engineered around. It's a fundamental barrier to permanent habitation. Human bodies evolved for 1 g of gravitational loading. Our skeletons and muscles and cardiovascular systems are tuned to function under Earth gravity, and when you reduce that gravitational load, the body deteriorates. Bones lose density, muscles atrophy, cardiovascular function weakens, and these effects accumulate over time. Astronauts on the ISS and microgravity lose 1 to 2% bone density per month despite intensive exercise programs. And while Mars has some gravity, unlike the ISS, 38% is still far below the threshold needed to prevent deterioration. Studies suggest you need at least 70 to 80% of Earth gravity to maintain bone and muscle health long term. Mars doesn't provide that. So people living on Mars permanently will experience progressive physical deterioration. They'll become weaker and more fragile. Their bones will thin. Their muscles will waste. And if they ever try to return to Earth, they might not be able to function in 1G. They'd be physiologically adapted to Mars and unable to leave. And this is even worse for children. If you're establishing a permanent colony with families having babies on Mars, those children will grow up in 38% gravity, and their skeletal and muscular development will be fundamentally different from Earth children. They'll develop weaker structures adapted to Mars gravity and will likely never be able to visit Earth or function in 1G environments. This creates a permanent physiological divergence. Mars-born humans become a different population from Earth humans, unable to interbreed or intermingle freely. You're creating separate subspecies of humanity rather than a continuous civilization. Elon Musk essentially ignores this problem in his presentations. He talks about the rocket technology and the cost reductions and the mission architecture, but he doesn't address what happens to human bodies living in Mars, gravity for years or decades or lifetimes. When pressed on it, he sometimes suggests that exercise will solve it, but the evidence from ISS shows that even intensive exercise doesn't prevent deterioration in reduced gravity. It slows it but doesn't stop it. Or he suggests that artificial gravity through rotating habitats might be developed, but that's not part of the current plan. Starship doesn't have rotating sections, and building large rotating habitats on Mars' surface is not something SpaceX is working on. It's a hand wave to a future technology that might never materialize. So the gravity problem alone is sufficient to make permanent, large-scale Mars colonization extremely problematic. You can send people there for limited duration missions and bring them back, but establishing self-sustaining populations where people live their entire lives and raise children is asking those people to accept permanent physical deterioration and creating divergent human populations. And it's not clear that's ethical or that people will accept it once they understand the implications. The second fundamental problem is radiation. Mars has no magnetic field and only a thin atmosphere, providing minimal shielding, so the surface is exposed to solar particle events and galactic cosmic rays at levels about 50 to 75 times higher than Earth's surface. The annual radiation dose on Mars' surface is approximately 200 to 300 millisieverts compared to about 3 millisieverts per year on Earth's surface, and this is for unshielded exposure. You can reduce it somewhat with habitat shielding, but you can't eliminate it without meters-thick shielding that makes habitats essentially underground bunkers. For short-duration missions, this elevated radiation is a risk that astronauts accept as part of the job. The increased cancer risk over a few months or a couple of years is significant, but manageable. But for permanent settlement, for people spending decades on Mars, for children growing up there exposed from birth, the cumulative radiation exposure would be severe. Cancer rates would be dramatically elevated, likely 10 to 20% or more increased lifetime cancer risk compared to Earth. Other radiation effects like cataracts and cardiovascular disease and cognitive decline would be more common. Life expectancy would be reduced. Quality of life would suffer. And shielding is difficult and expensive. To reduce radiation to Earth-like levels, you need several meters of regolith or water or other shielding material surrounding your habitat. This means building underground or covering habitats with massive amounts of material, adding enormous costs and construction difficulty, limiting windows and views, and creating bunker-like living conditions. You're not building pleasant surface cities with glass domes and open spaces. You're building underground warrens where people hide from radiation, living like moles in claustrophobic conditions with no natural light or views. Elon Musk downplays the radiation problem dramatically. He's claimed that Mars radiation is not that bad and is manageable. He suggested that rapid transit times reduce exposure during the journey, which is true, but doesn't address surface exposure during years or decades of residence. He's hand-waved about radiation shielding without specifying how the enormous amount of shielding needed will be constructed or how much it will cost. The reality is that radiation is a serious barrier to permanent Mars settlement. It's not an engineering detail that clever design solves. It's a fundamental feature of the Martian environment that makes living there hazardous and requires either accepting elevated disease risk or building elaborate, expensive shielding that makes surface habitats impractical. The third fundamental problem is life support and resource availability. Mars has no breathable atmosphere, no accessible liquid water on the surface, no soil suitable for agriculture, no ecosystem that cycles nutrients and provides resources. Everything needed to sustain human life must be either brought from Earth at enormous cost or manufactured from local resources using complex industrial processes that haven't been proven at the required scale. The atmosphere is 95% carbon dioxide at 0.6% of Earth's pressure. You can't breathe it, and you need pressure suits anytime you go outside. A breach in your habitat or suit means death in seconds from both suffocation and pressure loss. Water exists on Mars as subsurface ice in some regions and as trace atmospheric vapor, but extracting it requires energy-intensive mining and processing. You need to dig or drill to reach ice deposits, melt them, purify the water, and recycle it continuously. Because resupply from Earth is prohibitively expensive, food production requires growing crops in controlled environments with artificial lighting or in greenhouses, using soil that's been processed to remove toxic perchlorates and supplemented with nutrients. This is enormously resource intensive compared to Earth agriculture and has never been demonstrated at scales needed to feed substantial populations. Oxygen can be produced from the CO2 atmosphere using the MOXIE system that's been tested on Mars rovers. This works, but requires energy and equipment and produces oxygen at rates that would need to be scaled up by factors of thousands to support human populations. Energy is another challenge. Solar panels work on Mars but are less efficient than on Earth due to greater distance from the sun and frequent dust storms that block sunlight and coat panels. Nuclear power is more reliable but requires importing fuel and reactors from Earth and dealing with radioactive waste in an environment with no established disposal methods. So establishing self-sustaining life support on Mars requires solving numerous interconnected problems: water extraction and recycling, food production at scale, oxygen generation, power generation, waste management, habitat construction and maintenance, all using primarily local resources because importing from Earth is too expensive for anything but specialized equipment and supplies. This is an extraordinary industrial challenge that requires capabilities far beyond what's currently planned or developed. It's not just about landing people on Mars. It's about building an entire industrial civilization on a hostile planet using minimal imported resources. Elon Musk treats these challenges as solved or trivial in his presentations. He shows slides with Starship landing on Mars and deploying solar panels and ISRU equipment. He talks about using Mars resources to produce propellant for return missions, which is feasible in principle, but he doesn't address the massive scaling challenge of going from producing a few tons of propellant for one rocket to producing all the resources needed to sustain thousands or millions of people indefinitely. The complexity and cost and energy requirements are staggering, and there's no evidence that it can be done at the scales needed for large colonies, let alone done profitably or in ways that make colonies self-sustaining. Now let me discuss the economic problems with Musk's Mars plan. Because even if the technical challenges could be solved, the economics don't work, and this alone is sufficient to doom the million-person city vision. Musk claims that by making rockets reusable and increasing launch cadence, the cost per person to Mars could eventually come down to around $100,000, $200,000, roughly the cost of a median house in the United States, making Mars accessible to large numbers of people who could sell their Earth assets and buy tickets to Mars. And he claims that Mars colonization could become economically self-sustaining through activities like mining, manufacturing, research, and providing services to the growing Mars economy. But these economic claims don't withstand scrutiny. The cost of Mars missions is dominated not by launch costs, but by all the other systems and operations needed: life support, habitats, power systems, ISRU equipment, scientific instruments, communications, infrastructure, consumables, mission operations, ground support. Even if launch costs go to zero, the cost per person for a Mars mission would still be measured in tens of millions of dollars. At minimum, when you account for all these other elements, probably hundreds of millions if you're providing the infrastructure and support needed for people to actually survive and function on Mars rather than just depositing them there to die. To understand why, consider what's required. Each person needs a habitat with life support capable of sustaining them indefinitely. This means air recycling, water recycling, temperature control, radiation shielding, power systems, all of which require equipment and maintenance. They need food, either imported at enormous cost or produced locally, which requires greenhouses and agricultural infrastructure and energy. They need medical care and supplies, since injuries and illnesses will occur. They need tools and equipment for whatever work they're doing. They need spare parts and maintenance capabilities for when things break. They need communications with Earth. And all of this needs to function reliably for years or decades, because getting help or evacuating from Mars is extremely difficult. The cost of providing all this infrastructure and support per person is enormous, probably $100 million or more per person for the first settlers. And while costs might come down with scale and reuse, they won't come down to $100,000 or $200,000, because the fundamental requirements don't change. You still need all the same systems and capabilities. So Musk's claim about affordable tickets is fantasy. It's not achievable with any realistic technology or operations scenario. And when people realize that Mars tickets will cost tens or hundreds of millions of dollars rather than the price of a house, the market for Mars colonization essentially disappears. You're limited to governments funding scientific missions and perhaps a handful of billionaires doing it for prestige or adventure. And the economic sustainability claim is even more problematic. What does Mars produce that justifies these enormous costs? What economic activity on Mars generates enough value to pay for the infrastructure and support needed to keep people alive there? Mining is often suggested. Mars has minerals and metals, but so does Earth, and Earth is vastly cheaper to mine. The cost of extracting resources on Mars and shipping them back to Earth exceeds the value of those resources by orders of magnitude. You're not going to profitably mine platinum or gold or rare earth elements on Mars when you have to account for all the costs of Mars operations and Earth-Mars transportation. Manufacturing is another suggestion, but again, why manufacture on Mars when manufacturing on Earth is cheaper and easier? The only manufacturing that makes sense on Mars is producing things needed on Mars from Mars resources, but that's internal to the Mars economy. It doesn't generate export value that pays for imports from Earth. Services and research might employ some people, but don't generate Earth-tradable value sufficient to pay for the enormous costs of supporting Mars populations. Tourism is a possibility, but at the costs involved, only ultra-wealthy people could afford it, and the market is tiny. So there's no plausible economic model where Mars colonization becomes self-funding. The colonies will require permanent subsidies from Earth, either from governments or from wealthy individuals or organizations willing to fund Mars settlement for ideological or scientific reasons. And these subsidies would need to be enormous, billions or tens of billions of dollars per year to support even modest populations in the thousands, and they'd need to continue indefinitely because without them, the colonies collapse. This is completely different from Musk's claims about economic sustainability and self-sufficiency. The reality is that Mars settlements would be permanent dependencies, welfare recipients on a cosmic scale, surviving only as long as Earth is willing to keep funding them. And this dependency undermines the entire rationale for Mars colonization as backup for humanity. Because if Mars settlements can't survive without Earth support, then any catastrophe that threatens Earth also threatens Mars. By cutting off the support, they're not independent insurance, but dependencies that fail when Earth fails. So even the existential risk argument for Mars colonization doesn't work when you understand the economic realities. Mars doesn't provide the backup that's claimed because it's not self-sustaining and likely never will be. Now, let me discuss the timeline problems with Musk's plan, because even setting aside whether the goals are achievable, the timelines Musk has articulated are wildly unrealistic and demonstrate either profound optimism bias or deliberate misrepresentation. Musk has variously claimed that SpaceX could land humans on Mars by the mid-2022, then revised to late 2022, with a self-sustaining city of 1 million people by the 2050 or 2060. These timelines are absurd when you understand what's actually required to accomplish these goals, and examining why reveals how disconnected Musk's promises are from realistic project planning. Consider what's needed to land humans on Mars. You need a fully developed and tested transportation system. Starship is still in early testing with numerous explosions and failures. It's made significant progress, but it's years away from being human-rated and capable of the deep space modifications needed for Mars missions. You need life support systems capable of sustaining humans. For the 6 to 9 month journey to Mars, these need to be developed and tested extensively because any failures mean death. We don't have flight-proven systems at the scale needed. You need entry, descent, and landing systems capable of safely landing large payloads on Mars. This is extraordinarily difficult. The largest payload successfully landed on Mars is the Perseverance rover at about 1 ton. Starship would need to land 100 plus tons. Scaling up by a factor of 100 is not trivial. You need surface habitats and life support and power systems and ISRU equipment to sustain crew on the surface. All of this needs to be sent ahead and set up before humans arrive or sent with the crew and deployed. Either way, it's extensive infrastructure that doesn't exist and needs to be developed and tested. You need return capability, either producing propellant on Mars from local resources or sending propellant from Earth. The former requires proving ISRU at large scale. The latter requires multiple cargo missions delivering hundreds of tons of propellant. You need abort and contingency capabilities in case something goes wrong, redundant systems and backup plans because rescue from Mars is essentially impossible. Developing all of this takes time. The Apollo program, with essentially unlimited funding and national priority, took 8 years from Kennedy's speech to the first moon landing, and that was going to the moon, which is 3 days away, rather than 6 to 9 months. And Apollo didn't require extensive surface infrastructure, or ISRU, because missions were brief and everything could be brought from Earth. A Mars program with comparable priority and funding would likely take 10 to 15 years minimum from decision to first crewed landing, and SpaceX doesn't have unlimited funding or national priority. They're operating on NASA contracts and private capital, and Starship development is already taking longer than Musk's initial predictions. So even the most optimistic, realistic timeline for first crewed Mars landing is probably mid to late 2030 seconds. And that's if everything goes well and funding is sustained and there are no major setbacks, which is unlikely given the complexity. And that's just for landing a small crew, maybe 4 to 10 people, on a brief mission, possibly staying for one Mars opposition period, about 18 to 24 months, before returning. Scaling from that to a self-sustaining city with 1 million people is an additional enormous leap that would take many decades, at minimum, probably a century or more, because you need to gradually build up infrastructure and population and prove that large-scale life support and resource utilization work. And you need to do this despite the economic problems I described, where there's no clear funding model for such massive investment. So Musk's timeline of 1 million people on Mars by 2050 seconds or 2060 seconds is off by probably a century or more, if it's achievable at all, which I've argued it's not. These timelines are not sober engineering estimates, they're marketing. They're designed to generate excitement and investment and support by making Mars colonization seem imminent and achievable, but they're disconnected from reality, and when they're not met, the result is credibility loss and potentially loss of support for space programs more generally. And this is a pattern with Musk. He consistently makes wildly optimistic predictions about timelines, not just for Mars, but for all his ventures. Tesla has repeatedly missed production and feature rollout timelines. Full self-driving has been next year for a decade. The Hyperloop and tunnel projects have vastly under-delivered on promises, and SpaceX itself has missed many internal and external deadlines. Some of this is perhaps motivational, setting aggressive goals to push teams to work harder, but when the goals are impossible rather than merely difficult, it stops being motivational and starts being deceptive, and the Mars timelines fall into the impossible category. Now let me discuss the scale and logistics problems. Because even if you could solve the technical and economic issues, the sheer scale of what Musk is proposing presents insurmountable challenges. A 1 million-person city on Mars would require transporting 1 million people from Earth to Mars, plus all the equipment and supplies needed to support them. Musk envisions doing this primarily during launch windows that occur every 26 months when Earth and Mars are favorably aligned, with fleets of starships departing during these windows and landing on Mars after 6 to 9 month journeys. Let's do the mathematics on this to see if it's feasible. Starship, as currently designed, might carry 100 people in a Mars configuration. Though this is optimistic given the life support and consumables needed for 6 to 9 month journeys, to transport 1 million people you'd need 10,000 Starship flights. Launch windows occur every 26 months and last for a few weeks. Let's say you could extend this to a few months with less efficient trajectories, so maybe 3 to 4 months of viable launch period every 26 months. To transport 1 million people, you'd need multiple launch windows. Let's say you want to do it over 20 years. That's about 10 launch windows. So 1,000 Starship launches per window, which is about 10 launches per day, every day for 3 months during each window. This is an absurd launch cadence. The entire global space industry currently launches about 150 to 200 times per year total from all countries and companies. Musk is proposing launching 10 starships per day just for Mars during launch windows. This requires enormous ground infrastructure, propellant production and logistics, vehicle turnaround and maintenance, flight crew and mission control. The complexity is staggering. And this is just for transporting people. You also need cargo missions to transport all the infrastructure and supplies and equipment, probably multiple cargo, starships for every crewed starship, so the actual launch cadence might be 30 to 50 per day, possibly more. The propellant requirements alone are mind-boggling. Starship uses liquid methane and liquid oxygen. A fully fueled Starship for Earth departure requires about 1,200 tons of propellant, so each launch needs over 1,000 tons of propellant produced and loaded. 30 launches per day means 36,000 tons of propellant per day during launch windows. This is more than entire current global production of liquid methane and liquid oxygen for all purposes. You need to build massive new production facilities just for this application. And methane production requires either natural gas feedstock or synthesizing from atmospheric CO2, which is energy intensive. And you need to land all these starships on Mars, 30 per day, arriving over the course of several months as they complete their journeys. Mars doesn't have runways or landing pads or ground support infrastructure. You're landing 100-ton spacecraft on unprepared terrain. Each landing kicks up dust and creates hazards for subsequent landings. You'd need to prepare landing zones and build infrastructure to handle this cadence, and all of this needs to be done remotely or by early crews before the main waves arrive. Then you need to refuel the starships for return to Earth if you want to reuse them, which means producing propellant on Mars at enormous scale. The ISRU equipment and power systems needed to produce 1,200 tons of propellant per starship times dozens of starships is a massive industrial operation that needs to be established before the return flights. This alone is a multi-year, multi-mission campaign to set up, or you leave the starships on Mars and they become habitats or scrap, but then you need to keep building new starships on Earth at a rate of dozens per month to sustain the Mars campaign. The manufacturing capacity required is enormous. So the logistics of transporting 1 million people to Mars are impractical, even before considering whether those people can survive and function once they arrive. The launch cadence and propellant requirements and landing operations and return missions all present challenges that scale exponentially with the number of people you're trying to transport. This is not a tractable engineering problem with foreseeable technology and resources. It's science fiction masquerading as planning. And even if you somehow transported 1 million people to Mars, how do they live? Where are the habitats for 1 million people? The life support systems, the food production facilities, the power generation, the medical facilities, the manufacturing and repair capabilities, the governance and social structures. You can't just dump 1 million people on Mars' surface and expect them to build a functioning city. They need extensive prepositioned infrastructure or they die. Building that infrastructure requires thousands of cargo missions, delivering millions of tons of equipment and supplies, all of which needs to be deployed and set up and tested before humans arrive in large numbers. The scale of this infrastructure development is comparable to building a major Earth city from scratch, but on Mars everything is harder. Construction has to be done in spacesuits or by robots. There's no natural resources readily available. There's no existing supply chains or manufacturing base. Every tool and material either comes from Earth at enormous cost or has to be produced locally from scratch, building up industrial capabilities. This is a multi-century project, not something that happens in a few decades. You'd need to gradually build up from small initial settlements to larger towns to eventually cities, proving each stage works before scaling up. And this takes time measured in generations, not years. So the scale and logistics problems alone are sufficient to show that Musk's 1 million-person Mars city timeline is fantasy. The numbers don't work. The infrastructure requirements are beyond what's feasible in the claimed timeframes, and these problems compound with all the other technical and economic barriers to make the project essentially impossible as proposed. Now let me discuss the safety and risk issues, because Mars missions are extraordinarily dangerous, and establishing large permanent populations means accepting casualties and disasters on a scale that might not be politically or ethically sustainable. Getting to Mars involves 6 to 9 months in deep space exposed to radiation and microgravity, during which any major system's failure likely means death because rescue is impossible. You're too far from Earth to return quickly, and there's no way to send help that would arrive in time. Landing on Mars is difficult and dangerous. The thin atmosphere makes descent and landing challenging. Parachutes work poorly. You need propulsive landing with engines that must fire perfectly, and failure means crashes and death. Living on Mars is continuous danger. You're in a hostile environment where any breach of your habitat or suit means rapid death, where any life support failure means suffocation or freezing or poisoning, where radiation exposure accumulates daily increasing disease risk, where medical emergencies can't be easily treated because you don't have Earth's medical infrastructure, and medevac to Earth takes 6 to 9 months. The psychological stress of living under constant danger and isolation from Earth takes toll on mental health. We know from submarine and Antarctic research that people in such conditions experience depression, anxiety, interpersonal conflicts. And these problems would be worse on Mars, where you truly can't leave and rescue is impossible. And with large populations, the absolute number of accidents and deaths increases even if the per capita rate is low. If you have 1 million people on Mars, and annual mortality from various causes is 1%, that's 10,000 deaths per year. Disasters like habitat breaches or life support failures could kill hundreds at a time, and each disaster creates trauma for survivors and potentially political backlash on Earth, questioning why we're sending people to such a dangerous place. NASA's approach to human spaceflight has become extremely risk-averse after the Challenger and Columbia disasters, which killed 14 astronauts total. The idea that we'd accept thousands of deaths from Mars colonization seems politically untenable, and yet that's what large-scale settlement would inevitably involve. Musk tends to downplay these safety concerns. He's made comments about people dying on Mars being acceptable if they accept the risks and go willingly. He's compared it to historical exploration where many died, but the explorations were worth it. He's suggested that making humanity multi-planetary is worth significant sacrifice, including loss of life. But this cavalier attitude towards safety is concerning from ethical and practical perspectives. Ethically, it's questionable whether people can truly give informed consent to risks they don't fully understand, especially if they're being sold a Mars paradise vision that downplays the dangers. And practically, after the first major disasters with significant loss of life, public and political support for Mars colonization would likely collapse, funding would be cut, and the entire project could end, making the deaths pointless. So safety and risk need to be taken much more seriously than Musk does in his presentations. Mars missions require extensive safeguards and redundancy and conservative operations that add cost and complexity. You can't cut corners to meet ambitious timelines without accepting unacceptable casualty rates, and even with the best safety practices, Mars settlement will be dangerous with regular deaths. This is a fundamental challenge that makes large-scale settlement ethically problematic and politically fragile. Now let me address what I think Musk's actual motivations are, and whether he genuinely believes his Mars claims or is being deliberately deceptive, because understanding this helps explain why the Mars plan is structured as it is and why it will fail. I think Musk is a complex figure whose motivations are mixed. He genuinely believes that humanity should become multi-planetary and that Mars is the best option. He's personally committed enormous time and money to this goal. He's built SpaceX around this mission, and his passion for the vision seems authentic. But he's also a promoter and salesman, someone who needs to generate excitement and investment and support to fund SpaceX's development, and he's willing to oversell and make unrealistic promises if that serves the goal of advancing space technology and capabilities. So I don't think Musk is cynically lying when he talks about million-person Mars cities and affordable tickets. I think he's engaged in motivated reasoning where he's convinced himself that these things are possible because he desperately wants them to be, and he filters information through that lens, emphasizing anything that supports the vision and minimizing anything that contradicts it. This is a common pattern in entrepreneurship and innovation. Successful entrepreneurs often need unrealistic optimism to attempt difficult things, and sometimes that optimism is justified and they succeed against odds. But sometimes the optimism crosses into delusion, where you're not just stretching goals but pursuing impossible ones, and that leads to failure. I think Musk has crossed that line with Mars colonization. The specific goals and timelines he articulates are not achievable, they're fantasy, but he's convinced himself they're possible through a combination of genuine belief in human ingenuity and willful blindness to the fundamental barriers. And he's incentivized to maintain this narrative because SpaceX's valuation and funding and public support depend on the Mars vision. If he admitted that million-person cities are impossible and that Mars will at best have small research outposts, the excitement and investment would decline. People want to believe in the grand vision, and Musk gives them that even though it's not realistic. So Musk is not exactly lying in the sense of knowing the truth and deliberately saying the opposite, but he's not being honest either in the sense of giving people accurate, realistic assessments of what's possible. He's somewhere in between, genuinely believing in impossibilities and promoting them in ways that are misleading, even if not intentionally deceptive. And this creates a problem because people make decisions based on Musk's claims. Investors put money into SpaceX expecting Mars returns that won't materialize. Policymakers support space programs based on Mars colonization promises that won't be kept. Young people choose careers in aerospace expecting to work on Mars settlements that won't exist. When the reality becomes clear that the promises were unrealistic, there will be disappointment and backlash and potentially loss of support for space programs generally. Better for Musk to be honest about what's actually achievable. Small Mars research missions, scientific exploration, technology development that has applications beyond Mars. These are valuable and worth pursuing, but they're not the same as million-person cities, and they require different kinds of support and investment. The overselling is ultimately self-defeating because it sets expectations that can't be met, and when expectations aren't met, support erodes. NASA has experienced this pattern repeatedly, promising more than it can deliver in order to get funding, and then losing credibility when promises aren't kept. A more honest approach focused on realistic, achievable goals would build more sustainable long-term support. Now let me discuss what will actually happen with Mars exploration over the next few decades. Because even though Musk's grand vision will fail, there will be Mars activity, and it's worth understanding what realistic outcomes look like. SpaceX will likely continue developing Starship, and it might eventually become operational for lunar and potentially Mars missions, though on longer timelines than Musk projects, possibly 2030 seconds for Mars at earliest. NASA and international partners might use Starship or other vehicles for Mars exploration missions, sending small crews of 4 to 10 astronauts for scientific expeditions lasting one Mars opposition period, similar to Antarctic research stations where crews rotate. These missions would establish small bases with life support and laboratories and habitats, prove technologies for living on Mars, conduct scientific research searching for life and studying Mars geology and climate, test ISRU systems for producing water and oxygen and propellant from local resources, prepare for potential future expansion if it proves feasible and valuable. But these bases would remain small, dozens of people at most, dependent on Earth for most supplies and equipment, with crews rotating back to Earth after 18 to 30-month stays rather than settling permanently. This is a realistic, sustainable model for Mars exploration. It accomplishes legitimate scientific and technological goals without requiring the impossible economics and scale of large-scale colonization, and it's similar to how we do Antarctic research, which has proven sustainable for decades. Some people might stay multiple rotations, becoming Mars veterans. A few might eventually choose to retire there, spending their final years on Mars if health allows. But there wouldn't be large permanent populations or families raising children or self-sustaining colonies. Over the longer term, potentially by late century, if technology and economics improve, you might see the bases grow to small towns of hundreds of people, still dependent on Earth, but with more local manufacturing and agriculture, reducing import needs, still rotating most personnel, but with a small core of long-term residents, still focused primarily on science and technology development rather than economic production. But even this optimistic scenario is very far from Musk's million-person city. It's orders of magnitude smaller and more modest, and it might not happen at all if the barriers prove too difficult or if support wanes. So realistic Mars future is small-scale exploration and research, valuable for science but not transformative for human civilization. Mars remains a place we visit and study but not a place we settle in large numbers. And Earth remains home for the vast majority of humanity. This is a more modest vision than Musk promotes, but it's what's actually achievable and worth doing, and recognizing this allows us to focus resources and efforts on realistic goals rather than chasing impossible dreams. Now, I want to explore in depth what the failure of Musk's Mars plan means for space exploration more broadly and for how we think about humanity's future, because Musk has become so central to space discourse that his vision dominates public perception of what space exploration is about and where it's headed. When Musk talks about Mars cities and making humanity multi-planetary, millions of people believe this is the future of space, this is what we're working toward, and other space activities are judged by how they contribute to or distract from this goal. And if I'm right that this vision is fundamentally unrealistic and will fail, then we need to recalibrate our understanding of what space exploration can accomplish and what it should focus on, because the current Mars-centric narrative shaped by Musk is distorting space policy and investment in ways that are ultimately counterproductive. The problem is not that Mars exploration is worthless. It's not Mars is scientifically fascinating. It's the most Earth-like planet in the solar system. It may have harbored life in the past and might even have microbial life now in subsurface environments. Studying Mars tells us about planetary evolution and climate change and the conditions for life. These are profound questions worth investigating. The problem is that conflating Mars exploration with Mars colonization, treating scientific missions as stepping stones toward million-person cities rather than as valuable in themselves, creates unrealistic expectations and diverts resources toward colonization-focused infrastructure that may not be the best use of limited space budgets. Consider NASA's Mars program. Significant resources have gone into developing technologies for ISRU, for producing propellant and oxygen from Mars, atmosphere and soil, for testing habitat modules and life support systems, all justified as necessary for eventual human missions and settlement. And these technologies may indeed be useful for human missions, but the investment is proportional to settlement ambitions. If we were honest that Mars will only ever have small research bases, then we'd invest less in settlement technologies and more in scientific instruments and robotic exploration, which provides more knowledge per dollar spent. The Mars colonization narrative inflates the priority of certain development paths over others, not based on their scientific value, but on their presumed necessity for settlement that isn't going to happen at the envisioned scale. Similarly, SpaceX's development of Starship is explicitly oriented toward Mars colonization. The vehicle is designed to carry large numbers of people and cargo to Mars, to be refueled on Mars using ISRU for return flights. These design choices are driven by colonization requirements. But if colonization isn't realistic, is Starship the right vehicle? It might be over-designed for realistic Mars missions which need to transport small scientific crews and cargo. A smaller, more specialized vehicle might be more cost-effective and appropriate. Starship may still be useful for other purposes: lunar missions, satellite deployment, space station servicing. But its design is optimized for a Mars mission profile that's unrealistic, and resources spent developing it might have been better allocated to other systems if we were being honest about Mars prospects. So the failure of Musk's Mars plan matters not just because it means the specific vision won't happen, but because it means the current allocation of resources and attention in space programs is distorted by an unrealistic goal. And as this becomes apparent, we'll need to reorient toward more achievable objectives. What should those objectives be? I think space exploration should focus on several areas that have clear value and realistic prospects. Continued robotic exploration of the solar system to understand planetary bodies and search for life. Earth observation from space to monitor climate and environment and natural disasters. Maintaining and expanding human presence in low Earth orbit for research and technology development. Returning to the moon for science. And as a testbed for deep space systems, developing capabilities for asteroid detection and deflection to protect Earth from impact risks. Advancing space telescopes and observatories to study the universe and search for exoplanets. These activities are achievable with current or near-term technology and budgets. They provide concrete benefits in terms of knowledge and safety and applications, and they can be sustained over decades without requiring unrealistic breakthroughs or massive investment increases. Human spaceflight should focus on destinations we can actually access and work in, effectively low Earth orbit and the moon, rather than Mars, which is borderline accessible and extremely difficult to work in. We should be honest that human spaceflight is currently limited to relatively nearby destinations, not because we lack ambition, but because physics and biology impose real constraints, and we should pursue human spaceflight where it makes sense, rather than forcing it in situations where robotic missions are more effective. This doesn't mean abandoning human spaceflight. There's value in having humans in space for research and inspiration and maintaining capabilities and international cooperation. The ISS has been valuable, even though expensive, and it's worth continuing human presence in Earth orbit with successor stations. And there's value in returning humans to the moon to study it and test technologies and demonstrate capabilities. Lunar missions are feasible and can accomplish legitimate objectives. But we should be realistic about the purposes of human spaceflight. It's primarily for research and technology development and national prestige and inspiration, not for near-term settlement or economic development or solving Earth's problems through space resources. Those justifications are oversold and create false expectations. So what the failure of Musk's Mars plan should lead to is a more mature, realistic approach to space exploration, focused on achievable goals that provide value, honest about limitations and challenges, not making promises we can't keep about colonies and cities and multi-planetary civilization. This is less exciting in some ways than the grand vision Musk promotes, but it's more honest and more sustainable and ultimately more valuable.